Good evening and good afternoon to everyone joining us from around the world. We're delighted that you've joined us today, and we're now excited for our last session of the day on the US policy towards Iran. And we have a wonderful panel joining us with a wide range of points of view. I'll very briefly introduce our panelists so that you can see the full bios online. Our first speaker will be Suzanne Maloney, our own vice president, and also our resident Iran expert from whom you've heard before today. We're also joined by Major General Amos Yadlin, the executive director of the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, the INSS. He's the former IDF chief of military intelligence, the IDF attaché in Washington, and prior to that, also the deputy commander of the Israel Air Force. He's a pilot with many combat missions, including one very famous one over the Asirak nuclear reactor in 1981, relevant to today's discussion. We're joined and very delighted to host Dr. Ibtissam El-Ketbi. She's the founder and president of the Emirates Policy Center and the first Arab woman to lead a think tank. She's a professor of political science at the United Arab Emirates University and a member of the Consultative Commission of the Gulf of the GCC. Welcome, Dr. Ibtissam. And we're truly delighted also to host our friend Eli Geran-Maya, the Deputy Director of the Middle East and North Africa Program at the European Council on Foreign Relations over in Europe, where she's also a Senior Policy Fellow. She's advised European governments and companies for a long time, and in particular on Iran-related issues. In our tradition in this conference, we'll go straight to questions. And why don't we start with Washington, since this is sort of the pivot of a lot of this conversation. So Suzanne, I'll turn to you first. I think it's fair to say the Biden administration would rather focus its time on domestic issues, on COVID, on other foreign policy areas. Nonetheless, Iran policy is very high on the agenda. Could you describe a little bit of the policy dilemma facing the administration and where they seem to be going right now?
Thanks, Natan, and I'm really thrilled to be here with such a terrific group of analysts and experts and practitioners for this discussion. Obviously, the Biden administration comes into office with a number of other crises to contend with. The president was quite clear in the run-up to his inauguration that he would be focused on managing the pandemic, on managing the economic implications of the pandemic, that several of the other big issues he cared about deeply and saw as high priorities for his new administration would be climate and racial justice. But the Middle East has a way of inserting itself into the agenda of even the most determined American administration. And despite some talk from senior officials in various press articles over the course of the past few days about a desire to deprioritize the Middle East, Iran has found its way, I think, very high on the agenda in these early weeks for the new administration. And the real dilemma is this. The president campaigned, and it is the widespread policy and position of many Democrats in Washington that we need to end the approach of maximum pressure that was adopted by the Trump administration, that we need to navigate ourselves back into either the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the 2015 nuclear deal, or some other diplomatic arrangement which reimposes the constraints on Iran's nuclear activities that were part of that deal. But herein lies the rub. Do we sort of charge back into the JCPOA quickly in order to get those constraints up and implemented back as they were intended to be, as quickly as possible because of the urgency of Iran's continued breakout from its obligations under the deal, and because of the corresponding urgency on the part of many to provide the economic relief that was the U.S. obligation under the deal, and where we have seen sanctions having a real impact on the lives and livelihoods of ordinary Iranians. Or should the administration go for what Secretary Blinken described in his confirmation testimony as a longer and stronger deal? Should we, in fact, use the leverage, as it's described, that was assembled by the maximum pressure sanctions to try to force Iran to accept more strenuous constraints on its nuclear program, to address some of the issues that weren't part of the 2015 deal, whether it's the question of missiles or whether it's the wider range of concerns about Iranian policy? That presumably would be a much taller task for the administration, take much longer, leave us exposed to potentially crises and continued Iranian march toward nuclear weapons capability. So this is where we find the administration in these early days, and it is, of course, not a static situation. The Iranians are adopting their own stances and taking steps essentially to try to drive some urgency around this issue and try to force the United States and the international community to move as quickly as possible so that the Iranians themselves have to give as little and hopefully, from their standpoint, get as much as possible. I'll wrap up with this just sort of scene setter by saying, I'm encouraged by what I hear from the administration, what I see from the administration in terms of these early steps. I don't see an administration that is moving post-haste simply to get back to the JCPOA as an end unto itself. I think the objective ought to be, and at least from what these early steps from the administration demonstrate, really does seem to be the objective that we are trying to deter Iran's most objectionable policies. Diplomacy has to be front and center in doing so, but we don't need to hold ourselves hostage, so to speak, to the nuclear deal that was previously negotiated. What we need to do is get back to a process of diplomacy that can return us to real constraints on the issues of greatest concern with respect to Iran.
Thank you, Suzanne. And we're going to explore a little bit what others on the panel think of this approach. Amos, I'd like to turn to you exactly on this point of urgency that Suzanne mentioned. There seems to be a great concern in Israel about the urgency that some in Washington feel. And there's a bit of a contradiction. I wonder if you could help us understand. In the past, especially before the JCPOA, there was always a sense that Israel was was trying to get everyone to feel a sense of urgency about the Iranian issue. And now there seems to be much less of it. The counter argument, and we heard that from Chairman Meeks just yesterday, is that Iran seems to be closer to nuclear capacity today than when the United States left the JCPOA. Could you explain to us why you think, if you do think, the United States should not feel this sense of urgency? I think you're muted, sir.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be with you and with my colleagues. I have to remind everybody that Israel see the JCPOA from 2015 as a problematic deal. I'm not go as far as my prime minister, bad deal, but very problematic, especially as we approach the sunset, the later years, when Iran basically get legitimacy for a full-scale nuclear program, zero distance from the bomb, and this is not Prime Minister Netanyahu. This is President Obama. So this is the basic to the Israeli position. Yes, you pay attention to a phenomena that should be elaborated, that in the past, Israel have said the Iranians are very close to the bomb, and the US used to say, no, they are a year or 2 years from the bomb, and now they change positions. Because we are not measuring the time that Trump left the agreement. We are measuring the time of the interim agreement in 2013, when Iran was really close to the bomb. This is not the case today. Today, they used to have almost 12 tons of enriched uranium, some of it for 20%. This is not the case today. And the Israeli effort today is exactly the effort that was mentioned by Suzanne, that the deal will be stronger, longer, and maybe wider. And I'm sure if the Sam will refer to it, because there is also all the Iranian Millennium activity in the region that is not covered. And unfortunately, the Obama administration refused to act against it because they want to protect the JCPOA. So the Israeli position today is, first of all, don't rush, because the Iranians are pushing you. Once again, another reversal. The maximum pressure is now from Iran towards the US instead of the other way around during the Trump administration. don't rush. The Iranians want to go back to JCPOA more than you, but they are playing their cards better because you are transmitting that you want to go back. The Iranians haven't left the agreement because the agreement is serving them in the long run. They haven't left the agreement when Trump aborted the agreement. And they are very under a lot of pressure because of the economic sanction, and they want to go back to the agreement. And if the US administration will show weakness, it will never end. It's time now to show the Iranians you are under pressure more than us.
Thank you. Dr. Bassam, I'd like to turn to you, and it's a great segue to turn to you. You've written together with General Amos Yadlin on this issue. Could you explain a little bit your position and what both of you have argued for a JCPOA minus as a first step? And welcome again.
Well, first, thank you, and pleasure to be with my distinguished colleague. Well, you know, we are not against diplomacy. It's good, but it should be played well. Iran's approach to potential negotiation will probably be fragmented, dealing with each of the continuous issues in isolation with multiple parties. It's likely that Iran will try to ring fence the missile program, which it's considered strategic requirement for counterbalancing regional powers, and attempt to turn the focus to its regional expansion program, which has already lost much of its momentum and is in any case difficult to maintain. Now, Iran has always sought interim solution that buy it time to maneuver and the opportunity to cultivate difference between negotiation partners. Now, the regime will attempt to frame the priorities of the United States and other international parties with an Iranian perspective, suggesting alternative and solution based on Iran perception of international objective. This strategy will bear fruit if the Biden administration is content to outsource entirely the process of negotiation to regional power, resulting in a focus on resolving controversial issues between Iran and its neighbors. Like, now it will go to US. This is how they are thinking, okay? Now you are talking about who is pressuring United States. Rouhani and Zarif, why they are putting pressure? You have to understand how the game is being played in Iran because of the coming election, and they want to have a card that they were clever and they succeeded to lift the sanctions from Iran. Now, the other party, which is IRGC and Khamenei, what we call them, the alliance between the House of Leaders and IRGC, no, they don't want now to go back to the deal. Okay, let them play with that. If they lift the sanctions, that's fine. But they don't want, because they are planning to go back not to the 2015. This is Biden administration has to understand that they want to go to zero, where they are. You have to accept that they are start from 20% centrifuges, not before that. So this is the Iranian conservative wants. That's why what I would say that if a Biden administration should be having the strategic patience. Wait, don't let the Iranian push you to the corner and threaten that they will enrichment. As Amos said, they are about, you have 20%, you can go for enrichment. But the problem now, what does Biden administration plan B? If Iran does not or didn't come to the negotiation, or if Iran declare itself as a nuclear power. What is the plan B? Now, what Biden administration, from my point of view, what I am seeing is not acting strategically rather than reacting towards Iranian what's coming from Iran.
Thank you very much. Ellie, I'd like to turn to you. I think it's fair to say you have a slightly different view on some of these questions. And in particular, I'd like to touch on this issue of urgency, both in your view, but also in the view from Europe, where at least I sense a much more urgent approach to try and return to compliance, at least on the nuclear front, quickly and perhaps before presidential elections in Iran. Is that a fair description?
Hi, good day to everyone, and thank you to Brookings and colleagues for inviting me today. I look forward to the discussions ahead. So on your question, I think that we had quite an important and noteworthy indication of where the E3 countries that are party to the nuclear deal and the United States are headed from a joint foreign ministerial statement that was issued last week, which very clearly welcomed a US and Iranian compliance to the agreement and very carefully worded, and then they would look to strengthen various aspects of the agreement and also address issues of the regional concerns. Now, my sense is that from both European side and the Biden administration side, they understand that Iran's increasingly expanding nuclear activities presents the #1 security threat as seen from the perspective of the United States and Europe. I completely acknowledge that the perceptions, particularly among Gulf Arab states, is different on those priority risks, but this is where the #1 strategic threat from Iran is viewed in European capitals, and I would say the United States at the moment. I think what is pushing the urgency from the European side is a few things. One is that there are divided opinions, I would say, even here, about the extent to which the United States has more leverage cards to play. The Iranians were unwilling to fold to the maximalist terms that were put on the table for negotiations to start under the Trump administration. And I don't see that the Iranians are going to be willing to fold on similar maximalist terms under a Biden administration. If anything, they feel that they can withstand these pressures. And I think that they are in this position because despite the very dire economic situation in Iran, they feel that they can manage the economy, limp along for another 4 years if they have to, while also expanding their nuclear activities to the levels that they were pre the 2013 interim agreement that was mentioned. Now here they're being backed up actually by data that's coming out from the IMF, from the World Bank, that suggests that Iran, even with Trump era sanctions in place, even with the COVID pandemic, is likely to see a marginal upward growth. Now, that doesn't mean that Iran and its leadership can provide the optimal economy for a very disgruntled population at home. But I do think that it means, at least from their perception, that they can limp along. And what this means is that I don't see any appetite in Tehran right now to negotiate a JCPOA minus or a JCPOA plus deal. They have left the door, I think, wide open to diplomacy on returning to the JCPOA as it was without moving the goalposts. And in my view, this is the direction that, and now there is consensus, at least within the European capitals, that they need to move towards. And we are seeing suggestions that the Biden administration is also moving towards that approach, with this idea of having the European Union coordinate an informal meeting of the original parties to the deal with the United States. I'll finish with one quick note in that, there is a lot of focus on trying to broaden the JCPOA as it was to include missiles and regional issues. Now, besides from Iran being a major obstacle towards achieving that, I do think that we're going to have a lot of trouble getting Russia and China to agree to that. There is a legal mandate and a basis for the nuclear track of talks at the UN Security Council. And that mandate does not expand to missiles or regional issues. And there will be real difficulty in getting the sort of international consensus that really brought Iran to the negotiating table on the nuclear issue on other matters.
Thank you so much. I'd like to follow up just with one quick point. You described the sense of urgency. Is it fair to say that the Iranian presidential elections in May or June are a point that the United States and the European powers should be thinking of? Do they need to conclude a deal before that?
So like, there's lots of different views on this, and I'd be interested to hear Suzanne's views on it as well. My own position is they do set up a political timeline. First, because we have a technocratic team in place in Iran that has proven capable and willing to deliver on implementing the nuclear deal in 2015. It's very uncertain if the same team of technocrats are going to be in place to deliver that, the same way that, frankly, when the Obama team switched into the Trump administration, there was a lot of difficulties in even the technical scope of capability on the US side to manage the JCPOA. Added to that is the fact that there is now obviously a personal diplomatic link between the folks in the Biden administration and the Iranian Rouhani administration who negotiated the deal. And I think that that personal diplomacy does count in terms of pushing forward some of those difficult conversations that need to be had. And finally, I would say, I do think the timeline does create a sense of urgency, because I don't see necessarily the Iranian positioning on the JCPOA changing hugely pre or post elections. What I do see is the United States losing time to contain Iran's nuclear activities, because what is clear is that the longer this process drags on and the longer it takes for Iran to receive some sort of an economic benefit, the more and more nuclear activities are likely to expand. And I think that does create a sense of urgency for the Europeans, and it should do for the Biden administration.
Thank you. Suzanne, I'll jump back to you partly for a follow-up exactly on this question of the Iranian elections. You've been following Iranian domestic affairs for a long time and written extensively about it, which I might plug later. And I want to ask about that. Should the United States be considering these elections as a point in time? But secondly, a broader question. The maximum pressure campaign, many have pointed out, has not prevented Iran from advancing. And it has not buckled, as Ellie just detailed very well. Could it be, though, that it just hasn't lasted long enough, that the United States is now operating on a 4-year timeline where everyone is just waiting for the next president, and therefore, so long as the November 2020 elections were looming, everyone in Iran could wait and see. Maybe Trump would lose and the United States approach would change 180 degrees.
Thanks, Natan, and I'm really enjoying the conversation so far and the diversity of views. Let me just speak to the first part in terms of the follow-up with respect to the Iranian domestic political timetable. Look, it exists. Iran has real politics. The elections themselves will be a distraction of sorts for the political establishment in the country. However, in general, I don't think time pressure is a friend to good policy. You know the saying in the United States, which is you can't have things good, fast, and cheap. You have to pick which are important. I think with respect to policy, especially on an issue as difficult and important as this one, our pick should not be fast. It should be good. We want the right policy. We want the right approach. We should take our time. And I don't think that the political timetable from Iran should be a foremost either impediment or facilitator in terms of trying to speed ourselves up. The other point I want to make with respect to that question about the elections is simply that, especially on the nuclear issue, Iran is a unitary actor. The Iranian leadership is making this decision. It is certainly not a decision of President Rouhani or Mohammad Javad Zarif, the foreign minister of Iran. And the decision to implement and how to implement is certainly not theirs either. So this was a consensus decision back in 2013 and 2015 to come to the negotiating table and to get a deal that met the prerequisites of the supreme leader at that time who endorsed it, as did the senior leadership of the Revolutionary Guard Corps. If and when Iran is ready to either come back into compliance with the JCPOA or to conclude a new agreement, that will also be only done if it is the consensus position of the leadership, including and especially the supreme leader. So I think, I could spend all day talking about Iranian domestic politics and which direction it might turn, but I think with respect to U.S. policy, that should not be our driver. I hear a lot of people talk about, we have to prevent a hardliner from being reelected. That's fanciful. The idea that the United States, with absolutely no real influence on the ground in Iran, has any direct impact on the outcome of Iranian domestic politics, I think is absurd. So, our goal should be, and our goal has to be, really focused on the objective of trying to deter Iran's nuclear ambitions, to try to deter the broader concerns about Iranian policy. And let me just say a point about the kind of timeline that you asked me about, Natan, which is, have we done maximum pressure long enough? Do we need to wait a little bit longer? Realistically, I don't think we're ever going to come to a conclusion about that. We could keep the maximum pressure strategy in place forever. And what we would see, as we are already seeing, is that compliance with those sanctions would erode over time, simply because it's less realistic today than it was during the Trump administration that you would see an American Treasury Department that is willing to impose sanctions on third party or third country organizations that are doing business with Iran. So, at least some of the anecdotal reports suggest that Iran has been exporting in recent months as much as 1 million barrels a day of oil, despite the fact that, at least officially, the statistics are far lower than that. They're not necessarily able to repatriate the funds from those exports, and so there are real constraints. But the greater concern I have around the timeline is the extent to which the Iranians are going to use brinksmanship diplomacy to try to force everybody back to the table and force a deal that is suboptimal. We've seen that even in recent days with the threat to walk away from the additional protocol. We see that with the efforts to seize various ships moving in the region to try to essentially hold them hostage in order to get economic benefits. We see that with the turning up of the tempo in terms of attacks in Iraq by Iranian proxies. And most tragically, and I think most frustratingly, we see that with the proclivity of this regime to take hostages, to take individuals, in many cases, but not all, dual nationals who happen to be in Iran, and to use them for the very same purposes. So we have to be very clear-eyed about the nature of the leadership that we're dealing with here. I don't think we have forever and a day to deal with the Iranian problem, but I also don't think we should let the Iranians try to force an outcome upon us and upon the world that is suboptimal. The administration should take its time, formulate a good policy, let the rest of its senior officials actually be confirmed and put in place, and then come after serious consultations with partners and allies around the world, come to the table with Iran with a clear plan of action.
Thank you so much. There's a lot on the table. I'd like to get back to several of these issues with several of you, but almost, if I may take advantage of your expertise and experience, I'd like to turn to a slightly different question. The plan B, assuming this doesn't work, assuming the United States and Iran cannot reach a satisfactory deal for both of them, and assuming the worst comes to fruition, you have written, and as I've said, it's imperative for Israel to maintain a credible military option against Iran and to reach understandings with the United States regarding the conditions in which that military action might be taken. Could you, in the past, quite a few years ago, we were discussing whether or not Iran was in the zone of immunity. Does Israel still have a unilateral, credible military option? Can you tell us, does Israel have a unilateral military option that would set back Iran's nuclear program more than a few months or a year or two? Is that really credible? I think you're still muted. Sorry.
Plan B and long-range strategy is necessary when you deal with the Iranians. Because unlike the culture in your country and my country, which you aim to the 8 o'clock news or 6 o'clock news in your case, or the next primaries, the Iranians are planning for a generation, half a generation. We should adapt this strategy and having plan B and plan C and combine all of them. How can you stop Iran from reaching the bomb? There are basically 5 strategies, and all of them are connected and not mutually exclusive. You can reach an agreement, and this is, I think, the number one priority. But the agreement has to be an agreement that stops the Iranians and not let them get to the threshold 0 distance from the bomb with legitimacy to do. So agreement 1. Second, diplomatic pressure, sanctions, and the rest of the tools that diplomacy know how to apply vis-a-vis Iran. Then there are what I called strategy C, which is covert, clandestine, and cyber, all under the threshold of really kinetic attack, which is strategy D, and you ask about that. And strategy E is having another regime over there, or regime that, according to strategy B, changing his behavior. So what happened in the last decade? When Obama and Netanyahu came to power, both of them didn't believe in sanctions. Obama believed in agreement, Bibi believed in Plan D, Air Force. Somehow they agree on sanctions because of Congress, because of the Europeans. And Israel developed Plan D, which really helped the Europeans and even the Chinese and the Russians to agree to global sanctions. And when sanctions were really painful, the Iranians came to negotiate. Unfortunately, they were much better negotiators than the other side. But we have to prepare Plan B, not as something that we 100% will use, but diplomacy will fail as long as the Iranians will have your assessment that America has the capability but doesn't have the will, and Israel may not have the capability even though it's have the will. If the Iranians will feel that they are immune, diplomacy will fail. So I think the worst part of the future American diplomacy will be something like what I heard somewhere in the beginning of last century in a Saban forum in DC, when the Secretary of Defense is on the podium saying, a military option is a disaster. It's World War III. So if there is one issue that I'm not discussing in the open, it's the Israeli military option. But I only say it is there and it must be credible, as well as the American option. And when I speak, okay.
No, I'd like to come back to you actually with a follow-up. I recall that Saban forum. And I'd like to ask also about the military question, not just with regard to the nuclear issue. We've been talking about the nuclear issue so far, but of course, a big part of the demands by the US partners in the region are not about the nuclear issue, but about others. Could you describe what in Israel is known as the war between the wars, and a major effort by Israel and by Iran in poor Syria that has been sort of the battleground for a lot of this? Could you describe a little bit where that stands?
Yeah, I will describe it in a minute, but I have to agree with Eli that trying to widen the agreement to regional issues doomed to fail, because it's too complicated, too many players, and the way to deal with the Iranian millennium behavior in the region is to not to let them pass on that, because we are concentrating on nuclear issue. Yes, for Israel, the nuclear issue is number one. The Iranians are not threatening to destroy Europe with nuclear bomb. They are not even threatening to destroy Saudi Arabia or UAE with nuclear weapons. They do threaten to destroy, to wipe Israel off the map. That's why for Israel, the nuclear issue is the number one. Vis-a-vis Iran in the region, we developed another strategy, which basically say you are coming close to our border. We have a very good intelligence. We have a very good Air Force. I served in both of them. And we can cope with you. It's far away where you go, and you are going to pay a price. The Iranians, there was an Iranian general. His name is well known, Qasem Soleimani. 2016, he built a strategic plan. Once again, the Iranians are not doing it for next week and not for next month. 5 years plan to bring to Syria military component, Air Force bases, UAV, ballistic missiles, precise ballistic missiles, Shia militia from all over the Shia world, from Pakistan, from Afghanistan, from Iraq, and Hezbollah on Israeli Golan Heights. All this plan was looking into 2021. And when we stay today and see how much of it was implemented, maybe 10%. Why only 10%? Because of the campaign between the wars that Israel conducted against the Iranians. Are the Iranians decided to disengage back to the Iraqi-Iranian border? No, they continued. But as if Israel, with its superpower ally, the United States, will continue to cope with Iran and to stop them everywhere in the Middle East, I think this is the right way to separate the two issues. If you want to reach an agreement, a good agreement on the nuclear issue, fine, but continue to fight Iran on their malign activity in the Middle East. And the US should be partnering them.
Thank you. Ibtissam, if I can turn to you, this question of nuclear versus non-nuclear that Amos related to, this seems to be a big difference between Israel and the Gulf countries. I've heard some experts in the Gulf and even officials say that they don't think Iran would use nuclear weapons on the Gulf simply because it's too close. It could be quite dangerous for parts of Iran itself in terms of fallout. Could you describe a little bit the balance in the Gulf, if we can talk about the Gulf as one, between the nuclear considerations and other considerations?
Well, Nathan, you know that nuclear power, it's for deterrence. I mean, nobody will use it. Since Hiroshima and that, nobody will use it. But this is will give the Iranian the leverage over its neighborhood, and Iran, I think it will not stop. If I know the IRGC well, based on our studies, they will not stop. Their aspiration to join the club of the nuclear powers. Now, from our side, it's not that it's less important. We were upset with the nuclear deal because it did not take in its consideration the malign activities in the region and the ballistic missiles, okay? Now, I mean, the Gulfists, they are not against any deal with Iran. They are against that you just look, I mean, let me explain it now. There is a danger that Iran will propose solutions that reassure Israel and the European regarding its missile program, but reserve its short and medium range missile capability to keep Gulf interests under threats. Okay, now if the European are happy with the Iranian, they will propose for them regarding the range of the missiles or the Israeli, so they will not pay attention that we are in the front line of these missiles. So that's why the Gulfists keep just calling again and again that they should be join this negotiation, either the nuclear deal or which we propose in the article with Amos, that it should be goes on two tracks. Okay, if you on the other level, that nuclear deal, let's go in its way, but at the same time you have to have that negotiation regarding the ballistic missile, regarding the regional activities. This is how the Gulf is viewing that. It's not about which one is more important than the other. And this is the Iranian plays it well. I mean, if you look to the Zarif calling for regional, or even all their initiative, Hope Initiative, Hormuz Initiative, they are always calling that Iran and its regional, mainly the Gulfists. They don't want anybody to be on the table, which we argue that we need US there, we need the European, we need the UN to be on that negotiation table with Iran to be a guarantor for whatever will be come from that dialogue. And not to separate the files, not to separate the issues, not to start only what is the interest for Iran, like economic cooperation. Ballistic missiles should be there, malign activities should be there, because they are for us also dangerous. Now, if you look to Houthi, it's a model of Hezbollah. This is where Iran make things very difficult to solve. So what I am saying, you have to understand with whom you are negotiating. It's not as simple. I think the Israeli more understanding Iranian rather than European and the American. So they have the same strategic way in looking to the things. It's not now. So that's what I'm saying. You have to reach a comprehensive deal, which Iran does not want. Iran wants to separate the issues. That if you not go back, that deal 2015, it did not prevent Iran from go for more enrichment. It emboldened the IRGC and the House of Leaders. It did not, even those the money went to Iran, they used it, the IRGC, to embolden themselves and for regional activities. And the Iranian people did not get anything from that. So you have to learn. I mean, it's not about to come to the table. It's about how do you think that what you will achieve, okay? It's not about we sit on the table. What you will achieve, what's the outcome?
Thank you. Eli, I'd like to turn to you with a couple of questions, including on some of the Iranian thinking as you read it. But I'd like to first give you an opportunity to respond, because I think you have a slightly different take on a few of these things.
Sure, and I'm sure we can debate this for a long time, so I'll try and keep it quick. Look, my sense is that absolutely there should be a parallel track on the regional issues concerning Iran and all of the relevant players. In my mind, the way that you suck out the oxygen in terms of allowing Iran maneuvering space on the ground, particularly in hotspot zones in the Middle East, is to try and end the conflicts in many of these parts of the world where Iran has currently the upper hand relative to what it was several years ago. But I don't think you're going to, for example, fix Syria, fix Yemen, address all of the problems in Iraq by thinking that you can remove Iran from that equation. I think these are all much more complicated and will require intensive negotiations in different baskets that involve different sets of players depending on the conflict you're talking about. My sense is that the most obvious way and most realistic way to move forward on the regional track is for Iran and its GCC neighbors to begin a dialogue process that is overseen by the United Nations. I don't think that it would be acceptable for Iran, for the US to be the guarantor, nor would it be acceptable to the GCC countries for no guarantor to be present. But my sense is that if you're going to have some sort of a comprehensive dialogue about Iran's key military capabilities, which Iran views its ballistic missiles program as being such, you can't really dislocate that from the fact that countries like Saudi Arabia are the largest importer of arms. You can't dislocate that from the fact that Iran's bordering Pakistan is a nuclear armed state. You can't dislocate that from the fact that Iran shares 3 borders with either NATO or the United States, given US military presence in Afghanistan, Iraq, and the relationship with NATO through Turkey. So I think that, if we are going to try and either limit the range of Iran's military capabilities or significantly try and curtail its regional presence, Iran will demand that it has also concessions from other parties at the table. And really those concessions, I don't see really as being forthcoming unless there is some sort of a pressure for that approach from the United States and other global powers. Otherwise, we will be stuck in this dynamic for some time.
Thank you. And if I could turn now to the domestic question. In the past, we used to talk about reformers and conservatives, and I've heard a variety of different iterations of different camps in Iran, often from Suzanne. I wonder if you could describe a little bit to me how you see the map right now in Iranian internal dynamics, not just in terms of the vote in May or June, but in real terms of actual power. Are there genuinely different camps? Is everyone preparing for a change in senior leadership? What is the political mood right now?
So I think the most notable impact throughout the last few years of the maximum pressure campaign, what is viewed as a failed experiment on the negotiations with world powers and the JCPOA as viewed from Tehran in terms of being able to revive the economy, which, let's not forget, in 2013 when President Rouhani came into office, the #1 issue was the economy. And arguably he is leaving it in a worse state than he found it now when he leaves office. And that's after having curtailed Iran's nuclear activities. So I think that there is a huge amount of disillusionment inside Iran. There is a huge amount of apathy in the public. But looking at the political leadership level, what we are seeing now is more and more competition within the more conservative leaning camps and more marginalization within the camps that have voiced for economic integration with the world, with a more pro-diplomatic stance. And I think those voices have increasingly lost, I wouldn't say completely, but at least had a reduced influence on their ability to affect decision-making, which, as Suzanne pointed out, is usually made through consensus at the top leadership level. So my sense is that, particularly if there isn't a delivery on the economy from this Rouhani camp and figures associated with that, we are likely to see Iran's domestic politics likely take a more conservative and hardline leaning approach after the next presidential elections, as we've seen it take shape in the parliament following February elections. And while that may not be the game changer for strategic policy choices that Iran makes in the foreign policy remit, I do think it's a significant issue that needs to be factored when we're looking at what the next 4 years of Iranian foreign policy and domestic policy will look like.
Thank you. Suzanne, I'll turn back to you, partly to follow up on exactly the same question, and you're reading a little bit of the political atmosphere there, but also a little bit, well, why don't we start there and I'll follow up with an American question after that. Could you describe a little bit how you see the camps that Ellie described, but also the question of future leadership, of succession, if and when it ever comes at the top level?
Yeah, in principle, I don't disagree with anything that Ellie has just laid out. I guess in some respects, my view is a little bit more jaundiced at this stage, which maybe is just a function of age. I will say that, as I said before, there are real politics in Iran, but the trajectory that I've seen since that time at which I was still able to travel to Iran, which has been quite some time, is that Iran has, the politics of the establishment have narrowed significantly, and they have moved in a more hardline direction. And that's fundamentally not about U.S. policy. It has paralleled at times changes in U.S. policy which have not been conducive to any kind of elevation of reform. But fundamentally, the reason that we haven't seen a wholesale evolution in a positive direction from the political establishment in Iran is that the structure of power is set up to prevent just that. The supreme leader does not want the political liberalization, the expansion of political rights, the guarantees of civil and personal rights that are in fact in the Iranian constitution, but have never really been adhered to. The military, I think, coincides with that view. And so, you know, there's really no opportunity for anyone who has a differing perspective to advance in Iranian politics. It happened briefly and meaningfully. I think in the late 1990s, there was a movement, a genuinely reformist movement. And frankly, it came as a surprise to those who held the real levers of power. And they've done everything that they can do since that time, including imprison some of the leaders of that reformist movement under house arrest for more than almost a decade. And so, you know, we're in this situation where I think we're always waiting for some Iranian moderate politician to come to the fore. And that hope is always going to be frustrated by not Khamenei himself, not Qasem Soleimani, or any individual commander or personality from the security forces, but by a system that is designed to preclude that from ever happening. And during it does happen, a system that is designed to subvert and to disempower anyone who would seek to truly liberalize, to truly create a new sort of approach to the region or to the world. And I say that regretfully because it's certainly not the position I held, decades ago when I started my work on this issue. But it is reinforced, and the data point that I look to when we think about where the real balance of power lies and how to understand the sort of dynamics within the Iranian political establishment is the fact that on the very day the Iranian government signed on to a nuclear agreement with the international community, they detained and later imprisoned an American citizen who's been in prison ever since, and they later imprisoned his 80-something-year-old father as well, Siamak and Bakr Namazi, who are among an increasingly growing group of individuals, not just Americans, not just dual nationals, and in a way that at least some of those who've since been released report is very cynical. This is deliberately done as a means of bargaining with the international community. That's extraordinarily dangerous. And to the extent that we see these individual tragedies replicated on an institutional basis with the seizure of a South Korean tanker, largely to strong-arm the South Koreans in the world into releasing Iranian funds held in escrow. This is a very, very dangerous government, a very dangerous set of tactics, and frankly, it has been immune to all of the fascinating and interesting political changes within Iran over the course of the past 4 decades.
Thank you. And I'll ask you a short question that came from the audience. I'm paraphrasing slightly, but in the past, especially during the Obama administration, President Obama and Vice President Biden said more than once that all options are on the table, that if everything failed, they said this in part so as to try to calm Israelis and Saudis and others about concern over the negotiations. All options are on the table, and at the end of the day, the United States would, if necessary, even use force to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. Do you think that's still the position of President Biden? And do you think how credible do you think it is? Do you think, after that, I heard many people from elsewhere, not just from Israel, say, of course they were going for a deal. There was never, the last thing they wanted was another war in the Middle East. How credible do you think this message is from Washington? Do you think they're even trying to still project it?
I can't rate the credibility. I'm sure others on the panel will speak to that. I do believe that President Biden would be prepared to use force if that were required to prevent an Iranian nuclear capability. But let me just say, I think the more important question is when and how is he prepared to use force to push back on Iran's proxies and on the expansion of its influence across the region. This is an administration that does not want to get bogged down in the Middle East for good reason. Americans are deeply weary of that role. But what I think can say with confidence, if there is no pushback, if there is no corresponding effort to try to genuinely strengthen the capacity, the governance capacity of Iran's neighboring states, that we will see only a continuation of the trend which has lasted since 2003 of an Iran which is not just influential, because frankly that's somebody else's problem, right? The problem is that it's destabilizing. The problem is that it has the capacity to encourage proxies to launch rockets at either American interests or at neighboring states, and that is deeply destabilizing.
Thank you. Amos, I'd like to shift gears a little bit and turn to you on something else. We just saw a report that the United States and Israel have agreed to resuscitate the joint strategic forum that they had until things broke down between the two countries around the negotiations in Oman. This is a very different approach, obviously, than the end of the Obama administration. I've heard you say in the past that you certainly, and you've written, that you certainly support quiet consultation between the two countries. So 2 questions on this. First, could you describe a little bit, what does that serve? I mean, obviously the governments know each other very well. Can you tell us a little bit about how these things work and what the function of that is? But more broadly, there is a fundamental difference of opinion between the Biden administration and the Netanyahu government, at least. And sooner or later, if an agreement is reached with Iran, we may easily see a fundamental difference of opinion. How likely is it, do you think, that it becomes public again and resembles the second half of the Obama administration rather than a joint strategic forum?
Let's start with the 2 options that Israel had. And as you noted, it seems like they chose the right one, because nobody was sure that the prime minister is not going to use the same strategies that he used in 2015, basically saying any negotiation with Iran is a mistake. You should continue with maximum pressure, and Iran will give up or the regime will collapse. This, many people thought that this will be a Netanyahu position. He chose a better strategy, to my mind, a strategy which I am personally writing about from maybe 2013, 2015. Speak with your very important only ally in the world, the United States of America. You share the same goal. The goal is that this murderous regime will not have a nuclear bomb. This is agreed between the 2 governments. The differences is about how to achieve the goal and what strategy will serve the goal better. And you have to start to talk first on the picture, the intelligence picture, because there were times that we had differences. It seems like now we are closer on what is really happening. And then discuss the strategies. And my recommendation was, and I hope it will end up there, and it's come to the second part of your question, that Israel will not be part of the negotiation with Iran or the P5. Israel will have a parallel deal, a parallel agreement, a side letter or a side deal with America, which is saying, if all the assumptions that you put in the fundamental agreement in 2015 will be found not working, you know, all the naivety that Iran will change and the regime will be more moderate and the reforms will have the upper hand and Iran will take the money and put it to the poor people and not to Hezbollah, and that Iran will not cheat and Iran will not have we found something from 2015. Many assumptions were too optimistic. The whole base of the agreement was that Iran doesn't have a military dimension to the program. we have proved that they had. So there is a lot to speak on what the two countries are doing if a longer and a stronger agreement will not be agreed. Because if those in Washington who think that they have to go back to the agreement almost by all means, because Iran is going forward, because they have other priorities, I know all the songs. Okay, go to the deal, return to the deal, but agree with us and with our friends from the Gulf that if we are approaching the second half of the deal, which is dangerous, embargo is lifting, obligation, limitation on missile programs are lifting, and at the end, Iran is with legitimate nuclear program, then what Israel and the US, and if the Arab countries are joining as well, what we are doing? What is the red line? That I know that red line is not popular, so find another vocabulary. Where is Israel and America have, what is their plan B? What will they do then? When do they reimpose sanctions? Because what Trump have proved to the world that reimposing sanction is an American diplomacy tool. And if the Iranians refuse to come to negotiate a longer and stronger deal, there must be a deadline. 2023, 2022, August, whatever, something that we can agree upon, that if Iran continue with its Millennium behavior in the region and continue to refuse to amend the deal, then we are moving to plan B. And it's not a military attack immediately. There is a lot to do before. This is the last resort.
Thank you. Ibtisam, I want to pose a question that was sent to us. I'm going to paraphrase slightly, but a lot of the concern, of course, by regional partners of the United States is on Iranian activity, and in particular in places like Lebanon and like Yemen, which you have discussed. We've also discussed Yemen quite a lot in this conference already. One of the first major moves by the Biden administration in terms of foreign policy was to announce a halt of sale of offensive weapons in this context. But the question comes, and I think it's a very good one, how much leverage does the United States really have over these conflicts writ large? It has leverage over its support of Saudi Arabia, but can the United States really change Iranian behavior in Lebanon or in Yemen with the resources the United States has there at the moment? Is that a realistic expectation of the United States?
Well, I was telling this to another group yesterday, closed one, that you have to understand Iranian mentality, okay? Which I think the European and the American, they don't understand the Iranian mentality well. Yes, you can, but you have to know how to play with them for the same game. That's what I am saying. You don't think strategically. Now, look regarding Yemen, okay? A Trump administration declared Houthi as a terrorist group. Well, I was against that at that time, because if you want to put them to the negotiation table, you cannot bring terrorist group. But this has happened. You cannot lift that and you tell, no, Houthi is not a terrorist group anymore. How Houthi perceived that? He perceived that that's a green light. Okay, now, I don't know why Biden administration took that decision. Is it an incentive for the Iranian to come to the table to negotiate? It did not work. Houthi now is capturing Ma'rib, is going to the south. Houthi does not understand that. This is what I'm saying. You have to know the region very well from the lenses of the regional people here, not from the people there, you in Washington or in Europe, either the Iranian lobby or other, because you have to understand the region. Yes, you can have, otherwise Iran will take you a hostage. In Iraq, they will like what they did to Erbil, like what they did every day and every night against your embassies, wherever it is. Otherwise, you will have Hezbollah model everywhere, in Pakistan and Afghanistan, everywhere surrounding you. So you can have, but also the other thing, that if you are leaving the region, also this will not serve your interest. You will leave from the door, the Russian and the Chinese will come from the window, okay? So the dilemma will not be fixed or solved. That's what I am saying. United States needs to rethink the region again. Bring people voices from the region, not voices there in the DC. Here from the region, consult with us, discuss with us, because this is something. Because how can you deal with Iran without the people from the region there? Not only the Iranian, the Gulfists, everybody. Yes, and you have to stay in the region. Your interest in the region.
Thank you. Could I ask one quick follow-up question? In terms of the region, we talked a little bit about the difference between the Gulf and Israel, but I wonder, within the Gulf, there are important differences in points of view on many issues, including Yemen, between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and certainly others. Can you describe a little bit the differences on Iran? There are certainly very different relations with Iran among different GCC members. Could you describe a little bit the dynamics there inside the GCC with regard to Iran?
Yes, that's right. I mean, it depends. Well, let me take two mainly. The Qataris, because they are sharing the gas fields with Iran. So you have also to worry about. The Omanis, they are the closest, sure, to the Iranian, and always their foreign policy, it is moderate. Don't want to antagonize anybody. And they are worrying also that the Iranian, because they are sharing, and that bubble Hormuz, they are sharing Hormuz with the Iranian. Now, the players are the Saudi and the Emirati, whom they are also challenging the Iranian proxies in Syria and in Yemen. Yes, there is no coherence vision towards Iran, but I don't think that all of these six countries, they don't view Iran as a threat. Now, what is the level of the threats? This is varying between one and another.
Thank you very much. Ellie, I'd like to turn to you again and take your wisdom a little bit, both on the Iranian perspective, but also the European one, and touch on an issue that I think we've been dancing around and discussing, which is America's credibility in this whole story. If we think of the past 5 years, or 6 years now, the United States signed the JCPOA, then it very dramatically withdrew from the JCPOA, imposed maximum pressure. It's now talking about returning to compliance with the JCPOA if Iran does so first, and we saw the first little inklings of loosening pressure with the Korean deal or the Korean agreement with Iran. Is there much appetite in Iran for another deal with the United States, bigger, stronger, wider, better the day after? Is there sort of a sense that America, that the signature would last more than 4 years? Or would President Nikki Haley simply tear it apart? And what's the atmosphere in Paris? That's not to anoint anyone, and what's the atmosphere in Europe? What is the sense about the United States, the great partner in the transatlantic alliance in this regard?
Sure. Let me start off by saying, this agreement, the nuclear deal, was premised on confidence building and verification. It wasn't built on trust. And I think the unfortunate story here is that, this deal came really into fruition in 2016. January of 2016 is when things kicked off. The US eased back its sanction and Iran was declared to be in full compliance with its obligations. And then by November 2017, we had 2016 rather, so less than a year, we had a US president elected to take office that had campaigned on undoing the agreement. And so really within a year of this deal coming into force, you have a very different posture from the United States that's premised on pressure tactics that increasingly ratcheted up over the course of the 4 years. My sense is that the original parties to the deal always intended on having a series of follow-up talks, as with most arms control agreements, towards the end of some of the timelines. And the sad story here is, because of the maximum pressure, because of the US withdrawal from the agreement, we're now going back into a position where if the Iranians and the United States come back to full compliance with the agreement in 2021, we have a very short period of window for confidence building before those follow-up talks can take place. Now, my sense is that what will at a minimum be required before Iran's political elite are open to further serious discussions with the P5+1 on restrictions to its nuclear program, I'm not talking about anything else here, it will require at least some credible time of implementation. And really what the experience of the JCPOA has shown Iran is that there is really a strong body to verify what Iran is doing, which is through inspections by international monitors, through the assessment that's being put out by the Joint Commission body that was set up. But there is really no guarantor or verification body for the United States for US sanctions relief. And what we have seen under the Trump maximum pressure campaign is that the United States really doesn't need the rest of the world to impose quite quick and deep economic pain on Iran through its unilateral sanctions. And this is going to be the number one issue on the minds of Iranian leaders as they consider how a US re-entry and their own implementation of the deal will look like, hopefully in the coming months, but also whether they decide to negotiate further with the United States, how that process will be verified and guaranteed. Now, my sense is, and Suzanne can correct me here, is because of the way that the US political machinery works, particularly on Iran, it is very, very difficult, frankly, for any US administration to guarantee to Iran that a decision will not be reversed by a successor administration. And, in my view, there will need to be a sort of strategic decision made in Iran that it's worth taking another test run at diplomacy with the United States by coming back, reversing and dismantling its nuclear program that it has built up again over the last 2 years, and coming back into compliance with the nuclear deal. And really essentially hoping that confidence can be built enough in the coming years whereby prior to the next US elections, Iran and the US can reach some more stable set of arrangements, which may have greater bipartisan support in the United States. I'm personally not very hopeful that that can be achieved. But I think that in itself would be something that the Iranians are interested in, if there can be a more for more arrangement on the table. And it's going to be very important to see if the US administration will have the capability to deliver on a more for more deal rather than a one-sided Iran has to make concessions and the US doesn't. And finally, on the European side, look, I think that we are seeing slightly different positions by various countries in Europe. You could even sense that in some of the comments at the Munich Security Conference a couple of days ago. There isn't a sense in Europe that we can just rewind the clock and go back to the way things were before on transatlantic relations. But I think there's a deep hope that a lot of the damage that was done under the Trump administration can be mended. So there's a huge amount of openness, particularly among the French, the Germans, and the British, to try and mend those ties, including on Iran policy, where they see a lot more common interest with the Biden administration. But there are still, I think, a lot of folks questioning whether a US administration in 2025 will seek to basically undo a lot of the rapprochement and trust building that will be done in the coming years between the transatlantic allies.
Well, this brings us almost exactly to the end of our session, and I want to thank profusely all of our participants, Bassam El-Ketbi, Amos Yadlin, Eleger and Maya, and our own Suzanne Maloney. Really, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. As Suzanne said, this was the dream panel that we thought of when we started, and we're just delighted it came together. We look forward to continuing these conversations with you and with many others. And this will conclude our third day of our conference. Tomorrow, we will convene at 10 a.m. Washington time for the last day of our conference. So thank you again to all the participants, and thank you to all the audience joining, and we will see you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.